Well, thank you, Sheridan, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really glad to follow up from Dr. Drost's talk on cover crops as another way to improve your soil health by using compost. And so I'm our Extension Urban and Small Farm Specialist, but I'm a soil scientist by training, and compost is near and dear to my heart. So let's go ahead and get started. So today I'm going to be talking about first, I actually just want to define soil health and also touch on the importance of organic matter in our soils when we're thinking about our long-term sustainable soil management. And then I really want to get into compost types. They are certainly not all created equally. And then after we have a bit of a background in that, then I want to end it by talking about how to figure out exactly how much to add to your micro farm. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the term soil health is new, but the topic has been around for a long time in soil science. We used to call it soil quality, and I'm really glad we renamed it to soil health because it seems to be something that it's so much more intuitive, and it really resonates with people. This idea of maintaining, doing things for the soil to help the soil and keep it healthy. So the NRCS defines soil health. It's quite a long definition, but I wanted to pull out these key parts to discuss today. But it's the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So again, the sustained capacity. When we think about management, we're often thinking about what we're going to do this year. But when we're thinking about soil health, we're thinking about it in terms of the long term. What we do today and how those practices really stack up over time. And in addition to that, it's not just about crop production. I mean, it's certainly about crop production, but there's so many other things that we're feeding when we're contributing to soil health and managing for soil health. And so finally, managing soils so they are sustainable for future generations. Now, I want to just get a little excited about soil here. Because the soil does so many wonderful things for us. It has all of these diverse ecosystem services, from sustaining diverse plant and animal life to controlling many of our ecosystem processes. So where the rain and snowmelt and irrigation water go, do they run off the soil surface? Do they infiltrate? If they do, the soil can actually act as a filter and buffer out potential pollutants before that water reaches our water resources, whether it be groundwater or surface waters like lakes and rivers. It's also this amazing bank for storing and cycling nutrients. Nutrients get added, they transform, they get used by plants, they get added back in. And so if you're interested in considering soil as a bank, talking more about nutrients in particular, come by the soil session this afternoon and I'll be talking about that. And then lastly, thinking about the soil structure. So the backbone of the soil, how those particles are grouped together, they can provide stability and support for plant roots. So there's all of these things that the soil does for us. And when we think about soil health, we're really thinking about combining soil productivity, so the soil's ability to support crop production, with soil environmental protection. So things that we do to the soil, how does that add to environmental sustainability as a whole? And then also soil conservation. In the last talk, Dr. Drost mentioned how wind erosion is a problem for soil conservation and so forth. So we're thinking about all of these ways. When these three ideas intersect, that's really what soil health is. It's incorporating all of these ideas together. So when we talk about soil health and healthy soils, oftentimes we're referring to soils that have a lot of organic matter in them, or OM for short. And I think that organic matter has become extremely popular in the last few years, so a lot of you already know what it is, but just as a simple definition, it's the decomposed remains of plants and animals in the soil. And so most of those organic matter additions are happening at the top of the soil, at the soil surface. That's primarily where plants and animals live, die, become part of the soil. And so that's what gives our topsoil a darker color. It's the organic matter. If you were to take concentrated hydrogen peroxide and add it to some soil in a cup, it would bubble a bunch and it would get rid of the organic matter, and you'd be left with a very kind of beigey, tan colored soil. So it's really the organic matter that coats soil particles and gives it that dark color. If you were to dig a pit in the soil, you would also see that the the top layer of soil is darker than what's beneath it in most cases. So organic matter is part of the soil, and we're going to talk about its importance in a second, but I just want us to stop and appreciate the diversity of soils, even just across the US, even just in Utah. Because soils, if you dig down a bit, you can see that soils look really different depending on where you are. And that's because they developed over thousands of years under different conditions. So starting here on the left, so these are all soil profiles. They go about 3 feet deep. That's what the tape measure is for here. And starting on the left, this is an example soil from the Midwest. The historic vegetation, so the vegetation that grew there for thousands of years prior to settlement, was a tall grass prairie. And as a result, the roots from that system have lived and died and become part of the soil. It's a really deep-rooted vegetation community. And so you can see that the soil is extremely dark. It's almost black in color, black gold for sure. And if I look at the depth of that topsoil, I mean, we're flirting with 3 feet deep there. Certainly we're at least 2.5 feet deep with the thickness of that topsoil. So with it being that dark in color, there's also this beautiful granular soil texture. I like to call it the cookie crumb texture. That's just a really rich soil because over time there have been all of these inputs naturally by native plant communities. Now, when we head west, our soils formed under different conditions, and in particular, there's been much less precipitation as we go west and west. So here in eastern Colorado, you can see that the organic matter, it's not as black. So maybe in the Midwest, 4.5 to 5% organic matter is pretty typical. Now we're heading into eastern Colorado. It's a lighter color, meaning there's less organic matter enrichment in that topsoil. We're definitely at 2.5 feet deep now, so still quite deep. It's just that there's been less input here because over many thousands of years, there's been less precipitation, which supported a less intense plant community to contribute. Now we're in Utah here on the far right, and you can see that the color of the topsoil is lighter yet. There's less organic matter. It's also not as deep, about 1.5 feet deep here. And again, it's because there's less and less precipitation. So over thousands of years of these plants living and dying, this was just a less productive natural or native vegetation. And so I just want to point out that there's really different soils depending on where you are. Here in Utah, the average organic matter content of soils that have come to our soil test lab is between 1.5% and 2%. That's certainly pretty typical in northern Utah, but then down in southern Utah, it's common to find 0.5% organic matter. So in short, our soils need organic matter. And when we're able to maintain and add organic matter to our soils, there's a ton of benefits that come with it. It greatly improves the ecosystem services of the soils that we mentioned in a previous slide. So anything from improving the soil structure to reducing crusting and compaction, helping that water get into the soil by improving infiltration, allowing the soil to hold more water, especially if it's a sand, or drain better for clays, and then also provide and hold nutrients. So there's so many benefits from adding organic matter to the soil. But there's also some considerations. So in Utah, we need to add organic matter annually in order to just maintain our levels. Once we're farming in a Utah soil, the crops that we are growing are much more intense than what the native vegetation was in the past. So it's important to add organic matter annually. About 1 inch per year is a typical recommendation that we'll get into. And even more would need to be added to increase levels. But the sources of this organic matter vary considerably. And so the things that we really need to consider, it's not just about adding organic matter to our soil, but also what's coming with it. What's the nutrient content? What's the salinity? And what's the pH? So this question I love, which is how much compost should I add each year? I love this answer or this question because it's asking ahead of time. It's planning ahead of time for how much to add as opposed to just adding as much as possible, because that can get us into trouble. But the answer is, I hate to say it, typical academic response, it depends. But let me explain why. So when I first got here in Utah, the Utah Soil Analytical Lab kindly turned over all of their records to me. And I did an analysis of all of the compost and manure that we've ever received. What are those test results like? And then what I did was I created these tables in order to kind of break it down and give the averages based on the type of compost. So the top ones here listed are manure-based compost, and then I've got other composts listed at the bottom of this table. And this is my fact sheet, Sustainable Manure and Compost application, if you'd like to learn more. But just to summarize that here, so there's many other things you can learn about the compost. There's a big range in these numbers. I'm just giving the averages here today, but I've got the percent nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are our primary macronutrients, the ones we need to manage the most. And I've also included the pH and salinity. Now here in Utah, we have to be extra good farmers. We have to keep in track of our nutrients, our organic matter, also our pH and salinity. So many things to think about here. Our average pH across the state from the soil test lab samples is between 7.5 and 8. So our pH trends a little bit high. It's on the alkaline side. Most plants like to be around neutral, if not a tad bit acidic. And so pH is something to consider. Is the thing you're adding going to increase your pH? And more importantly, is it going to increase your salinity? So back in the slide when I showed the different soil profiles, and we could see that there was less organic matter accumulation just naturally in Utah soils, not because they're bad, but they just haven't had the plant life to support that. And in turn, the precipitation to support that plant life. When we don't have a lot of precipitation, we don't get the rainfall in the summertime like many states across the US do, what happens is that our salinity can build up in the soil. And I'm going to have a slide on salinity to explain that a bit more, but to a soil, a lot of things can look like a salt. It's not just table salt. There's other things that count as a salt in the soil. And so it's very easy for our salinities to build up. Now this is a fancy unit, decisiemens per meter. It doesn't matter. Your magic number is 2. So you really don't want your soil's salinity to increase past 2, because then that's kind of the threshold for when we start seeing problems in a lot of our horticultural crops, many vegetables, fruits, nuts, and flowers. So these are the things that we need to think about for deciding on what compost to pick. So my ideal compost source is one that generally has more N than P and K, a pH that's around neutral, and the lower the salinity, the better. Now, I didn't explain the nutrient part of things, and we'll get into this a little bit more as we go along, but a lot of times what people find, especially here in northern Utah, is that our soils tend to accumulate phosphorus and potassium pretty readily, and it's actually easy to approach excessive levels of phosphorus and potassium. And so many find that annually, all they really need to add is nitrogen. And when we take this back to soil health and really put this in perspective, this is important because managing the right amount of nutrients in the soil is not only relevant to crop productivity, but it's also thinking about environmental sustainability. This time of year, we're getting a lot of rain, we have a lot of snow melt, therefore runoff is happening. And a key contaminant for our surface water bodies is phosphorus. This is what causes algal blooms in lakes. And so not having too much phosphorus, not having more phosphorus than you need in the soil. And then potassium actually counts as a salt to the soil, to plants in the soil. So you want enough potassium, but you don't really want more than that. And so these are things to consider when you're selecting a compost. I just want to point out chicken manure, it's got the highest salinity here, chicken manure-based compost, highest salinity, 16. The reason for that is because here's a picture of chicken manure. That white that's on the manure, that's actually their urine, and that's what contains so much of the salt. And so that's why a lot of the bird manure-based composts are higher. Okay. So a note on salinity. I kind of danced around this a lot, but just to summarize that, so salinity is a problem in our soils. It's something that I'd say it's the most common side effect of adding too much compost that I see. I'd also say that of all the emails I get troubleshooting crop growth, my first question is, have you used compost or manure? And if so, how much? And the answer 99% of the time is yes, I have. And then we go from there. And it typically is a salinity issue that I'm seeing. So salts in the soil are a problem. They reduce the plant vigor and often yield if it gets too high. We want to keep our soils around 2 or under 2 is ideal. After 2, there can start to be problems. And that there's a lot of things that count as salt in the soil. It's not just table salt. I've got a few of them listed here. You'll notice that many of them are also plant nutrients. So we've got potassium, magnesium, sulfate, calcium, chloride, all these things. These are plant nutrients. So we certainly need some there. We just don't want the soil to get to excessive levels. And so that's a big thing to consider when adding compost in order to sustain soil health. So the best way to sustainably add compost is to start with a soil test. Now, us soil scientists will say you should get a soil test every year if you're growing annual crops. But I got to say here today, if you just get one soil test ever, that would be great, because it gives you a baseline of where your soil is at. You know, these numbers let us know something about the soil that we just can't see. And it can help avoid a lot of issues later on. So these pay off in spades. If you can get it tested after that, you know, regularly, that's a bonus, but do it at least once to see where you are. Again, because compost increases soil organic matter, which can improve soil health, but it's also increasing your nutrient content. So you got to know what nutrients you need in the first place, and then also the salt content or the salinity of the soil. So get your soil tested. Find a lab in your state. I know that there's a lot of folks here from Utah. I highly recommend the Utah State University Analytical Lab. I've got the website here on my slide, usual.usu.edu. This is a fantastic place to get a soil test and get started. For those of you who are out of state, I urge you to contact your local extension service, find out where the lab is in your state. Most land-grant universities have a soil test lab. And the reason for that is because there's so much diversity in our soils, as we've seen now and talked about a few times today, that the labs that are in your state have the tests that are best for your soils. So if you live in Maine, don't send your soil sample to Utah. It's not going to be the right test that we run. We run our regionally relevant soil tests here. So find a lab in your state, get it tested, and then these are the tests. There's so many options. You could spend as much money as you want on soil tests, but in thinking about compost use in particular, the key things are knowing what your salinity and pH are, and what are your phosphorus and potassium levels. Okay, number one place to start, soil test. Now, say you get your soil test back. I want to talk about times to not add compost. You can still enhance your soil health with organic matter additions. Just pick something other than compost, or add very, very, very small amounts of compost. So cover crops would be a great option in this scenario. This is one that I've got an example soil test here on the top right. This is a really typical one from here in Utah. pH is 7.8, typical. It's not going to be a problem, but it's getting a bit high. The salinity is 2. I know that this farm in particular was at 1 a couple of years ago, so their salinity has gone up a bit, keeps creeping up. Phosphorus and potassium. So phosphorus is 246, potassium is 424. I've got this little cheat sheet here on the bottom. Optimum phosphorus level is 20 to 30, and then potassium 126 to 300. And so you can see that the P and K are quite high for this soil. And remember, when we're talking about soil health, it's not just about crop productivity, it's also about environmental protection, soil conservation. And so in this case, adding something that comes with P and K isn't the most sustainable option. Now, a very basic rule of thumb is that if that's not a problem, if you have some room for P and K in your soil, salinity is not an issue, you can generally add about 1 inch per year for annuals. If and there's a lot of caveats here, but if you know you have a low salt compost and you really, really, really need organic matter and you're not going to be creating excessive P and K levels, you could add 2 to 3 inches of a low salt material. But oftentimes just logistics get in the way too. 1 inch is quite a few wheelbarrows to cover 1,000 square feet. So about an inch per year. The most sustainable way, however, though, is to actually use your soil test results and calculate the exact amount you should be adding. So you can add it based on your P and K needs. For example, if a soil test came back and said that you needed 1 pound of phosphorus and potassium per 1,000 square feet, you can actually either get your compost tested, or you can take a look at this handy dandy table to get an estimate of the of the content. So I'm going to use this plant-based one as an example. I like it because it's got a higher N content than P and K. Typically, we need more N than we do P and K. In this case, it's got 0.9% phosphorus and 0.9% potassium. So what you would do, this is the handy equation, and I know in presentations, equations are where the presentation goes to die, but hang with me here. It's a pretty quick one. You take your soil test recommendation. They said 1 pound of phosphorus per 1,000 square feet. So you take that 1 pound and divide it by the percent of P or K in the compost. So here it's 0.9%, I can see from the table, and then multiply it by 100. And that comes out to about 110 pounds of compost per 1,000 square feet. You'll be meeting your phosphorus need and potassium without going over, completely sustainable. And then just the density, so to convert a weight into a volume like a wheelbarrow, it really depends on the density of the compost, varies a lot, but jazz hands here, waving my hands, 1 wheelbarrow is generally about 100 pounds of compost. So that would be the most sustainable way to figure out how much compost to add to your soil to maintain soil health, including crop productivity and environmental protection. So if you were in a situation where it really wasn't a great idea to add compost, high salt content or concerning salt salinity, P and K are getting to be excessively high. There's many other options for adding organic matter, and I just love Dr. Dross' presentation today on cover crops. You don't have to worry about salinity issues with those. You can also incorporate your crop residue as long as it's not diseased. If it's diseased, you shouldn't even compost it, it should be thrown away. But incorporate any kind of plant material that you can add is going to help build up that carbon in the soil or build up that organic matter in the soil. There's certainly trade-offs with these, more work with cover crops, mulches. There can sometimes be weed seeds that get introduced, but you have to weigh that with the trade-off too of not getting these excessive levels of nutrients or soil salinity. So these are some other options. And so with that, thank you all so much for listening. To summarize what I said, soil health is all about managing the long-term sustainability to balance these 3 key things. So if you add a high salt compost once, is it going to kill the soil? No, probably not. But if you keep doing that, what's that long-term sustainability looking like? And are you balancing these 3 ideas? Adding lots of compost is often done out of good intentions, but it can lead to excessive amounts of nutrients and salinity. I think I've beat that one down quite a bit today here. So what I ask you to do is just know what you're adding and maybe diversify your options. Give soil a healthy diet of different organic matter sources than just compost. Be mindful of what you're adding. And so the last thing here is that I think that we all have really good intentions with our soil, and we want to do everything this season and make that soil perfect for our plants. But really, we should think about managing soil as a long-term activity. It's something that we're doing over time. We're slowly improving it over time. I'm not going to go from 1% organic matter to 5% in a year. I'm going to slowly build that up. That's the best way to go. So with that, thank you so much. And I'm available for a few minutes of questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Stock. So a couple questions here. What's the best way to get an analysis from compost providers? Molly says she's asked a couple of times. People look at her like she's crazy. She asked like the farm store for an analysis of Nutrimulch, and they said no one had ever asked that before. So is that something that's out there and readily available? Do you know?
If they are selling compost, they need to have a guaranteed analysis. Now, the store you're buying from probably doesn't have that analysis, but you can contact Nutrimulch, for example, and find out what it is. On occasion, I'll say that I've contacted a lot of landfills around Utah. I always ask in a really nice way, non-judgmental way, hey, curious about, compost, can you send me the analysis? And they've all been really great about it. I have heard of a few folks or sources that haven't been forthcoming. And in that case, I would just pick another source. The other option you have is you can actually send in for the compost to be tested at a soil test lab. It's actually run as a manure, not a soil, but the lab can give you exact results on that too.
Excellent, thank you. I know you've talked a lot about salinity. Can you flush salinity out of manures when you add them to garden soils? And how do you get salinity levels down, like in your garden, if your soil test comes back with a high salinity? And would compost tea be a less saline option?
Okay, that's a great question. So yes, you can remediate a soil that has a high salinity. It's a lot of work and it can be very expensive. That's why an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But what you'd have to do is leach out the salts. So you'd have to add a lot of water. First, you have to saturate your soil completely. So about, 45-50% of our soil is actually airspace or water. You have to fill that all with, you have to add a lot of water to saturate the soil. Then if you want to cut the salinity by 50%, you have to add an additional 6 inches of water on top of that to flush it out. Now, that also depends on your water source. If you're using irrigation or secondary water, sometimes that can come with a higher salinity. So using culinary water gets expensive for doing that. So 6 inches cuts 50%, 12 inches cuts 80%, and 24 inches of water cuts 90%. One of the ways you can save a little bit of water is trying to do that either in the fall and then having our snow melt and so forth help wash it, our wet season wash it through, or in the spring, the soils are already pretty saturated to start with. So there are ways to come back from it. The other thing is, but I guess the other issue here is if your water table is high, then that's not going to be such a good route to go. I think there was more to that question and I'm forgetting it, but yeah. The compost tea.
Tea.
That's a good question. We're actually going to be starting a study on that here soon, but I think when you're creating a compost tea, you're extracting the nutrients, but you're also extracting the salt with it. And so, so there you are on that. We're going to be testing that and we'll have more exact numbers on it, but I suspect you're also extracting the salt. We're also going to do some tests to look at how much rinsing or leaching of compost does it take to reduce the salinity of different sources too. So stay tuned.
So with compost, do you recommend tilling it in? Can you just add it on the surface? Which is better?
So, tillage is always a controversial topic to discuss, but I love it. If you have a compost source that has a higher salinity, tillage is a great way to go to kind of dilute it out. I keep a lot of chickens. I compost their manure, so I know that my compost, and I also have rabbits, so I know with these animal sources that the salinity of my compost is a little higher. Therefore, when I add a very conservative amount in the spring, and I do till it in for that reason. Another benefit from tillage is that you're actually mixing the nutrients into the root zone as opposed to having them sit at the surface. So you're able to match the location of where plant roots actually are. And then on top of that, the soil, you're less prone to nutrient losses in the runoff if your nutrients are in the soil. But of course, when you till, you're also disturbing the soil, you're breaking up those aggregates. So it's certainly a trade-off. If you're using a lot of compost, I would recommend at least tilling every couple of years.